Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on Mastering Logistics KPIs, the must-have list for supply chain leaders. I'm Derek Browning. I'm Director of Consulting here at Uber Freight, and I'll be both presenting and moderating today's webinar. And also with me is a fellow Director of Consulting, Roger Stickler. How you doing today, Roger?
I'm all right, Derek. How are you?
Very good, very good. Just to give folks on the line a quick kind of context, Roger and I are out of the Uber Freight Consulting Division. We've got over 2 decades of consulting experience in our ranks, and we really excel in areas like transportation optimization and procurement, working for organizations that are utilizing Uber Freight's 3PL, 4PL services, or those that use neither. We do supply chain strategy and design work. We can do full network optimization projects down to a product line level and really tell an organization what their future state network should look like. We do facility and process optimization so we can step within the 4 walls of facilities and perform assessments and design work as well as transformation work, full implementation and project management services. Our business intelligence analytics, which we'll be touching on a lot today, can partner with organizations and help them really craft KPI and performance metrics for their supply chain that's going to help drive results and uncover problems along the way. And then our project management implementation services and training education helps organizations as they're transitioning from current state into future state, handling major transformational activities and work streams along the way. Today, we're going to be spending some time touching on measurement system frameworks, and then we're going to move into common KPIs that we see in supply chain, as well as a little time, the fun time I like to call story time, where Roger and I can exchange some of the horror stories, and then want to spend some time with you all and hearing your questions. So as always, we've got an active chat and Q&A open. If you've got questions along the way or want to comment on some of the things we're talking about, please chime in. We want this to be interactive as possible. Now, as we get going, when we start thinking about metrics and KPIs, there's a tendency to jump straight into what do you measure and what do you benchmark? And I like to slow folks down and say, let's answer a few questions. First of all, what are we trying to measure? Are we trying to measure inputs or outputs? Are we measuring silos or systems? And do we want a metric and a measurement system that are going to drive behaviors or performance? And so as we angle in on these question and answers, the inputs versus outputs discussion helps organizations think through. We all want to be very results oriented and results focused, but those results come from somewhere. And the upstream processes and inputs required to drive those results are just as important for us to understand, to measure, and to monitor along the way. So a good measurement system is going to have a strong balance of input metrics as well as output metrics. And then as we step into silos and systems, any supply chain is a function of the output from various upstream functions. And so when we measure our supply chain just as individual silos, it can drive individual silo behaviors. It can have the individual silos focusing on their own performance. And that can be either to the benefit of or to the detriment to the system as a whole. And so as we measure the system of the supply chain, we want to measure the multiplication efforts of the different silos along the process as they work together as one team. And then on the behaviors and performance side, our metric system should drive different behaviors. And we can often point to behaviors that are happening inside of a supply chain and connect them to the measures and the metrics that are occurring. And so we want to make sure that we've got measures and metrics in there that are driving the right behaviors. And then from a performance standpoint, we want performance being measured so that problems and opportunities are uncovered. And it's not just a system that validates the individuals. The old story comes to mind of the organization that was performing very poorly while all the executives had dashboards that were green. All of those dashboards showed very positive, but the organization itself was suffering. So once we get those questions answered, then we like to go into and scope out how those individual measures function within the overall system. And there's a couple of different directions we can take this. One could be a core function measurement system. This core function measurement system can span across different layers of a network or segments of the network, or measuring the supply performance or individual plant performance, or across into distribution and final mile performance, and have more of a vertical view of the organization. And we can follow a framework like a perfect order framework or a 10 rights type framework. Another popular way of rolling out and deploying KPIs is that what's called KPI trees, where the KPIs will follow a certain framework, but be more horizontal, either at an enterprise level, or you go down into divisional levels, or into site levels, or even departmental levels within individual sites. And so we can chase a framework of a metric down. A common in manufacturing, we often see this HRD, human resource development, along with the safety, quality, cost, delivery type measurements, and it'll go down through the organization and enable you to tree from one level to another through an organization. So whichever direction you go, there's certain rules and guidelines that are going to be applicable to all. Roger, do you want to take us through some of those ground rules?
Yes, there's a few things we want to highlight today with you when we talk about what are the right metrics, what are the right KPIs. There's a ton of top lists out there. There's a lot of metrics folks track. So what we want to share is some things to keep in mind as you're developing the right metrics and the right KPIs for your organization. And the first one is really make sure there's a purpose. There's a ton of data out there around supply chain and operations. There's a ton of tools that help you aggregate that. We can come up with a million different ways to measure things, but often we see sometimes organizations have metrics that they have because they came as part of a suite of BI tools, but they don't really matter to the business. So as you're thinking about, what KPI should I track and where do I put my energy? The first step is make sure there's a purpose to things you're tracking. Don't just track stuff because you read about it on a top list or because it came as part of your software. But if you're going to invest the time into tracking something, it's because it's important enough to measure and is a good indicator of your business. So make sure it's got a purpose behind it. The next thing is make sure that you're measuring them consistently, right? And this is consistent not just period over period, but also across functions, especially for some of those tree level metrics. You have things like fill rate that might be calculated differently based on a production planning based fill rate versus a distribution center fill rate. So it's okay to have different metrics, but make sure the metrics identify how they're measured consistently. So when people are talking about the same metric, it means the same thing to them. The next step is pretty basic. Make sure it's timely and accurate. Accuracy is key. If people don't trust the data, right, they're not going to trust the metric enough to make changes based off of it. And it really has to be timely enough to be able to be relevant. If you're measuring things, 60 days past occurrence or sometimes even 30 days, so much has happened between when your metric was captured and when you're reviewing it that you've missed the opportunity or you've missed the ability to make the influence. Make sure your metrics are based on timely data that's accurate enough for people to feel like they can take action on it. And then make sure it's available. This is a really important one for both dealing with vendors and customers, is making sure the metrics you have are available to the people that should be seeing it, right? So if you're measuring, for example, transportation, if you're measuring a carrier on-time delivery and you're measuring that every day, you should be sharing that with them probably every day so that they understand what your view is. Similarly, if you're working with customers, you're measuring something like perfect order levels or order lead time compliance, things like that. Make sure the people that have the ability to influence the metric actually have access to it, and they have access to it in a way that they can use it. So if you're dealing with a vendor and all of your metrics are organized based on your division codes or ledger codes, it might be challenging for a vendor to figure out the underlying causes. So sharing the data and making sure it's available. There are so many web portals and online tools that are available these days, but the most common sharing method remains spreadsheets, right? So if you're just sharing weekly spreadsheet scorecards, that's okay. Just make sure it's available to the right people. Then make sure it's actionable. This gets back to make sure there's a purpose, right? Making sure the metrics are at a level at which you can do something about them. So there are certain enterprise level metrics, and we'll talk about a couple of these in a few minutes. There's some enterprise level metrics that are just good to know. They're good to track. Those generally should be developed in a bottoms up manner that then allows you to dig into the actionable level details. So my total transportation budget I might not be able to act on it, but I need to know, am I trending in the right direction or not? And then I can dig down into the various cost buckets around line haul, fuel, accessorial, other things. So make sure that when you've got a metric, part of the purpose needs to be that it's actionable and you can take some improvement programs against it. And then make sure somebody's accountable, right? So again, back to being a purpose, if you have metrics for which nobody is accountable, then it's unlikely those metrics are really going to be impactful for your business. So every KPI should have an owner. They should understand the math. They should understand the background behind it, the appropriate level of drill down capability. But somebody ultimately needs to be accountable for tracking that performance and making sure that improvement plans are in place if things aren't going according to plan. So I think over the next few slides, we're going to share some of the metrics we see broken down by the core functions and the trees that Derek talked about. This is not intended to be a comprehensive list. Every organization is going to come up with the metrics that matter most to you. What we want to do today is share a few that we like to see or that we do see out there, talk a little bit about some of the kind of the pros and cons or pitfalls of some of them, and then really just talk through how we see that reflected out in the industry. And planning is one of those first key buckets. And forecast accuracy is something every organization, I think, tries to do. It's something I think most organizations sort of struggle with. The metric for that typically is MAPE, mean absolute percent error. And that's really just factoring in your forecast error over a given time frame. And to my earlier comment around consistency, it's important to understand what time frame you're measuring for which metric, right? A production planning forecast accuracy number might be based on a 3 or 4 week production schedule. A sales forecast accuracy might be based on more of a monthly or quarterly sales plan. So you need to track both, but you also need to make sure that everybody understands what time frame those are applying to. Production adherence and attainment are pretty common production level metrics. It's really, am I making the things I'm supposed to be making, and am I making the right quantity of them? Similarly, from a purchase perspective, am I buying or are my suppliers supplying the items I'm expecting them to supply, and are they supplying them in the right quantity? If you see these two metrics start to slip, that may be an indication that there's some underlying process problems or underlying data problems that need to be addressed. So these are kind of headline numbers, but they can be a good indicator that there's something going on underneath the surface that warrants some more investigation. This last one is just a metric that we think and we see becoming a little more impactful as interest rates are going up, cost of capital is higher, and it's really a measure of how much inventory do you have on hand that is unavailable for sale for various reasons, right? It could be because it's on quality hold, could be due to customs issues, could be due to packaging mismatches or label non-compliance, but there's inventory, cash, investment that you have tied up in things that for some reason aren't able to be sold. We'd like to think this isn't a problem, and if you've got a really great, forecast process and production process, hopefully it's a small number. But it's worth taking a look at, particularly as we get into areas where capital is more expensive, inventory needs to be leaner. How much stuff do you have on hand that is unsaleable can be a way to flag where you've got some cash drains. Derek, anything on planning you want to add? Any comments on those?
Yeah, I know the story that comes to mind. There was a project we worked some time ago where the supply chain had a lot of challenges in the manufacturing environment. And yet their forecast accuracy and a lot of these accuracy numbers were showing very strong. And as we dug into it, this root cause analysis found out that the material planners and inventory planners were going in and changing the values at last minute as soon as they got confirmation from suppliers and input that this is what was going to be available. And so as a result, you end up with a measurement system that's showing that everything is working well. And then you walk out onto the floor and you find out it's not. And so one of the recommendations that I like to tell organizations, let's make sure we define those lock-in dates and communicate that. So that way, even if we do make changes to the system later on for more operational needs, that we are measuring against a lock-in date so that we can see how much stability exists within this overall network. And then moving into order management, as we think about some of the different functions in supply chain, these are 3 metrics that I've really enjoyed over the years for those of us that really enjoy KPIs. One is just basic order accuracy. When we think about the total cost of supply chain, if we do not have that order accurate at the beginning, then all of the costs after taking that order end up being a waste in many ways. And so for us to come in and make sure that we've got the right information, the right level of accuracy and specs and addresses, it's critical at that stage. So a measure of order accuracy is important. The order to ship lead time. This could be a number of days or an hours metric between when we receive an order and when products ship. Key here is that as we're measuring it, that we measure all of the activity in the upstream process, because it tends to be the case that supply chain executives will hone in and target some of the value creating aspects of the lead time and completely ignore the wasteful aspects, just kind of assuming they're there for a purpose. So if we measure the entire process, we can often find that there's days, weeks, or hours worth of wasteful activity that can be eliminated to improve that lead time. And then the back order percentage, we had a bit of debate about this one coming in. There's many organizations that will manage or monitor a back order log or a backlog, and they want to have some level of back order always there for stability, for production, or different aspects of the supply chain. One of the measures I like to have here is a percent of shipments that were not shipped from the optimal source point at the required ship date, meaning that they in effect went into some form of a back order category, even if they were fulfilled from another facility. And this is a take of kind of an on-time shipment metric, so that we're measuring the effectiveness of our supply chain, and it highlights where there's gaps and problems for us to go deeper level. What do you think of those, Roger?
Yeah, I think those are three big ones, nice ones. And I think order management sometimes is an area that maybe doesn't get a lot of focus within particularly kind of large, complex organizations, but it really is where a lot of the details of success happen. You know, as we work with folks and do supply chain strategy work or assessment and help develop KPI management systems, you know, one of the big challenges we see a lot of people face, and we have to help them overcome, is defining the metric. And to your comment earlier, Derek, about cutoff times, right? Fill rate is another one that can be heavily manipulated. And so, you know, when we look at shippers and we look at, you know, their measurement systems and how they compare against what their customers see, very often we find a gap between the shippers measuring fill rate, and it's always a few percentage points higher than what their customers are telling them, or what they're getting in terms of feedback from emails from clients or destinations or things like that. And what often happens is a fill rate metric might be designed to be based on, you know, I take a snapshot after my order is confirmed, not after I ship it. And so cuts that happen in a warehouse might be missed. And so it gets kind of back to that accuracy piece, just making sure you understand the purpose of the metric and that the math matches that. So you can identify those discrepancies between your internal stuff and customers. The distribution metrics, this is another function. Again, there's a million metrics out there. These are three that we think are really, really important. The first one would be inventory accuracy, right? Do you have on hand what you expect to have on hand, and is it where it's supposed to be, right? So it could be a percentage of either the units or the value of inventory based on what your systems think. But really just tracking either through cycle counting or physical inventories, things like that. You're making sure you understand, do you have what you think you have on hand? Space utilization is one that is becoming, it's always something that folks have tracked, but if you haven't revisited your metrics and the math behind it, now's a great time to do that, particularly as we see shippers who maybe secured a lot of excess warehouse or production or distribution space, you know, during the pandemic, 2020, 2021. Some of those agreements are coming up. This is a good one to make sure that you understand how much space you actually have available and what percentage of that you're using. And what we find recently is sometimes some of those additional satellite locations that were brought online, they don't always make it into the kind of the corporate level space utilization metric. So you may look like you're very over capacity in terms of you've got a lot more product than you have space for, but it's because sometimes these satellite locations or additional spaces were brought on so quickly that they never made it into like a real estate tracking system or even just a spreadsheet tracking square footage. So, you know, even if you're tracking things like this, now is a great time to take another look at them and make sure that the data still matches the reality. Then unload dwell is often something we talk about relative to transportation with folks, but it's a really key metric as well for distribution and facility operations teams. If you're not measuring today, you know, how long it takes your facilities to unload and turn a piece of equipment, a container, a trailer, an intermodal box, something like that. You know, a lot of times those costs will show up in the transportation bucket in terms of accessorials and dwell charges, but this should be a metric that you're measuring at your sites. From the time something arrives and is available to be worked, how long does it take you to receive that inventory, bring it in-house, and turn that equipment back into something that can be used productively? So this is one of those Again, it typically is a transportation metric, but if you're not tracking it at your facilities, it might be a blind spot that you just don't have access or visibility to. Derek, anything on those you want to?
The unload dwell, that's big for facilities, because often it's measured by transportation, but it's caused by distribution, and it's a good handoff point to measure. On the inventory accuracy, I remember in the height of COVID, we went into a facility and they were having a lot of challenges with productivity, a lot of challenges with getting orders out on time. And so as we dug into the problem, one of the things that was surprising to us and the leadership there was how great their inventory accuracy measures were. And when we looked at why they were so great, is because the leaders of the site were doing a fantastic job, in quotes, of managing when they did write-offs, and they were measuring at more of the total volume or total value type level, and not at, hey, is this product, when I send a picker there to go pull that product from that shelf, is that product in that shelf? And so they could get a dump of orders and sending pickers to different areas of the warehouse, and the inventory just wasn't there. And so they had to, people moving all over the warehouse trying to find product. And then at the end of the day, because they were managing the write-offs, overall it showed well. And so I tend to like to press a little bit deeper, and I care less about the quantity or the value overall. And it's more about, is it in the right place when we need it? And so when we're doing a cycle count or a count back, we want to make sure that it's in the right place and measure when it's not, so that we can go back and fix those issues and retrain on processes so that we can drive performance. And as we transition out of distribution into transportation, we've got thousands of transportation metrics, so it was very hard to pick my three favorite. But here are three unique ones that I think may cause some folks to think. The first measure there is a reason code health. And it is very common for us to measure when shipments are late, or when they're late arriving, when they're late departing, and to try to capture some form of a reason code. But oftentimes at the operational level, for the purpose of expediency, or because we didn't know, we will have a default value entered or a miscellaneous value entered. I'll go to run a Pareto on a reason code and find out that 90% of our causes are miscellaneous. And that's not necessarily actionable. So we like to have a reason code health metric that just kind of measures to what degree are we capturing root causes. Another metric that is going to be something people have their eyeballs on. I'm seeing a question come in, and they're asking, what is the best metric to track to try to predict when the freight market will turn? And there's a lot of folks gazing into crystal balls trying to identify that moment. But the spot versus contract rate is a comparison of actual incurred spot rates versus primary carry contract rates, and we like to monitor that over time and see how it's fluctuating, and is it in the right ratio for where the market's at in any given time, and to what degree does it deviate from our strategy? So if our strategy is to have a heavy contract percentage, and we're finding we're heavier in spot, then we need to dig into that and understand why, and it leads us to certain root causes that we can close gaps on. And then an emerging metric here that I'm really excited about. Some of the folks at Uber Freight have been measuring the average impressions by lane. So when you post something to the spot market, and we've got drivers or carriers that are browsing for lanes that may be of interest to them, it is not uncommon for them to look at a site and say, hey, that site's not a carrier, or not carrier friendly. That site would not be a shipper of choice. That site has bad reviews, so I'm just going to pass up that site and look for another one. In the past few months, even a couple of years, hasn't been that big of a deal because we've had enough capacity to cover those gaps. In the coming years, we think it's going to be a very important metric that organizations need to start thinking about. What are your thoughts, Roger?
Yeah, I think that one's an interesting one. Historically, if you had a pretty deep route guide, one of the metrics that a lot of shippers used to track was tenders to acceptance, right? So how many tenders did I have to make on a given load? This is in a tight capacity market, which is not now, but it will come. Is how many carriers did I have to tender a load to before they accepted it? The way route guides are managed today and with the access to spot market capacity, that's a little less indicative. But this one is really interesting. Now that we have visibility to a lot of those transactions behind the scenes, it's nice to see, if you see a lot of carriers looking at a load or a lane and not bidding on it, that tells you that the rate's not attractive, the lane's not attractive, or there's just so much other things they could do, and capacity is getting tighter. And the reason code health I want to talk to for a minute, because we talked earlier about kind of inputs versus outputs. There's not going to be anybody that gets excited across your organization about saying you've got really high reason code health metrics, but your transportation teams should, right? So it's a good way to track, are carriers giving you the good data you need to be actionable? And this really helps get into timely root cause analysis. And it's a great metric to include during carrier performance reviews or QBRs to say, look, of the 35 late shipments you had yesterday, half of them came in with normal status, right? There should be nothing normal about a late shipment. They have the ability and the data to give you a little bit more detail so you don't have to start everything from scratch. So that's a metric. It's more of one of those, are you getting good data input into the process? But it can really help you save time on the output and make your activities more actionable. So now we're going to dig, I think, a little bit into some of the tree metrics, which are a little bit more enterprise level with drill down capability. The first topic we want to talk about here is around resiliency and agility. And this is a tricky one for a lot of organizations because many organizations, in fact, just about every public statement we see talks about we want to build a more resilient organization or a more resilient supply chain. But that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? And so a couple of things that we think are worth looking at and tracking when you want to assess your organization's resiliency and its agility is, the first one would be diversity of supply. And we mean diversity in terms of, do I have options for certain things, right? So a metric for this could be the percentage of your items or input commodities for which you're relying on a single supplier or a single facility. So if you think in terms of like single point of failure modes, this is one to identify at least where you think or know you have that kind of risk out there. And again, that could be from a supplier perspective. It could be one production line makes one of your key items. So if that line's down, you have a problem. So developing and collecting the data that helps you understand where your single path or single source is a good way to start building some sort of resiliency framework. From a people perspective, succession planning is always a tricky one, but this is one where within your organization, we see and work with HR groups on what percentage of your critical positions. Typically, it's some sort of executive level, but also can be really functional knowledge experts, like at a plant level or within a function. How many of those have identified backups or contingency plans? That doesn't mean you have to necessarily go with that opportunity or that solution when something happens, but it's important to make sure for key roles or key areas of expertise, you at least have a stopgap measure while you go through your normal personnel processes. So you have a way to say, of my mission critical personnel, do I have a way to function if they are out for a while or if they leave or something happens? And then business continuity, a lot of companies, most have some sort of business continuity plan. For us, when we think business continuity, it's really important to make sure that those plans are reviewed and tested. And again, to make this accountable, make sure you're measuring, does that actually happen? So what percentage of my manufacturing facilities have pressure tested their business continuity plan in the last 6 months? Or what percentage of my functions do I have a business continuity or data recovery plan for? And have they tested that recently, right? When we think of things like data breaches, ransomware, stuff like that, having these plans in place and making sure you dust them off periodically is important. And a way to measure that is just to make sure that activity is happening at different levels within your organization. Derek, anything to add on these?
Yeah. The team succession planning, as you KPI tree that down to frontline levels, I typically see that manifest as more of like a cross-training matrix. It's making sure that we've got kind of core functions with multiple people on a team that can backfill in the event something's happened. And anytime we see that, hey, there's an area where we've got all of our A players working on their A tasks, but don't know anything about other tasks, it's an area that we need to intervene proactively before we're put in a position of figuring it out later. And then on the diversity of supply, there are certain commodities in some industries where you just can't get diversity. We've got one or two major players that only have that commodity. It's usually a known situation, but there are other situations we see where maybe as a broad spectrum of suppliers and tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers that provide a certain commodity type of product. But our procurement folks in their kind of tier one diversity measurement may have 2 or 3 providers that all use the same supplier. And so as we get more robust in our measure of diversity of supply, we want to measure how our suppliers are building redundancy into their network and have their own resiliency and agility measures. And I've seen organizations of size go back all the way to tier 5 just to make sure they know where everything is coming from. And they'll do it from a resiliency and agility, but also thinking about it from a sustainability perspective. So increasingly, we're seeing sustainability become very popular in metrics, and organizations starting to really see the value of it. And so a few sustainability measures we'd like to see, the carbon CO2 equivalent emissions. We've seen that begin to be measured in more mid-tier organizations. A lot of the large organizations already have metrics in place. I've seen more and more active measures in medium-sized companies. The mode utilization, this is more of a transportation metric, but it's got a heavy kind of cause and effect relationship with those CO2 equivalent emissions. So if you take an example, a route that could have went intermodal from a service level standpoint, and end up receiving all the benefits of the CO2 emissions, but instead went truckload because the routing guide was not correct, or because someone wanted to load it in a different process, whatever reason. Those mode utilization metrics are going to have a net effect on the emissions, and it's good for us to start measuring and monitoring what those effects are. So it's not just cost. And then the network compliance. So as we think about overall the percent of shipments in our network that are shipped from the optimal source, in day-to-day activity, when we've got to get orders at the door, it is common for us to ship it from a point that isn't optimal. And while we cannot solve the problem on that individual shipment, it's good for us to know it happened, why it happened, measure its compliance, and then start to dig in and do some root cause analysis so that we can prevent it long term. Roger, what's your thoughts on the modern sustainability movement?
Yeah, I think this is a really important topic, and it's a really active topic for a lot of companies and organizations. I think the things that we say just to keep in mind is, the old saying was, green is green, right? So a lot of the things that we've all done as organizations over the past few years to save money, many of them have the same effect of improving our sustainability footprints. When you think of things like packaging waste reduction or manufacturing waste reduction, increasing, shipment payloads, things like that. Those things have historically been done, with a goal to save money, but they also have a really big impact on your environmental footprint. So it's important to, as you're looking at sustainability metrics and you're looking at sustainability reporting and things that your organization can do, these are some key metrics that help with that. But look through your cost structure programs over the past few years. I suspect you're doing things that were done primarily for economic purposes. They may have an additional sustainability component, or you may find that if you tweak the solution just a little bit, not only would you save money, but you'd be able to reduce things like packaging, wall thickness that saves materials, things like that. So as we get into some other big buckets, cost is a big one. Everybody's got cost metrics. There's a million ways to measure it. We talked earlier about some headline numbers and making it actionable. One big one is logistics cost per unit sold. This is primarily around transportation and warehousing, but all your logistics costs, either as a dollar per unit sold or as a percent of sales. But it's important to understand just how that's trending, especially as we get into a period of, a little more market uncertainty from transportation side, and a little bit of loosening in capacity and cost on the distribution side. It's important to understand at a high level how your costs are trending. Line haul cost above plan. Again, this is another transportation when there's so much data out there around lane benchmarks and rates and route guides and contracts. But at the end of the day, one of the most important things to be looking at is, are you paying in every lane what you expected to pay, either coming out of your bid or based on your budget? If not, that usually means there's some underlying activity going on. But it's important as one of those core baseline metrics. And then cost leakage, this is usually done at sort of an operational level, right? So there are things like equipment utilization is an operational lever that has a cost leakage component. If I'm not hitting my utilization, my cost per unit is going to go up. Things like LTL use, right, might be a utilization. Case pick versus pallet pick at a warehouse level can be a good indicator of cost leakage. If I've got more case pick than planned, that should be a leakage metric that I'm tracking. So these can be developed at a number of different levels, but it's important to, in general, when we say leakage, we like to think of it in terms of what are operational activities that I can track that have a cost component. What do you think, Derek?
Yeah, no, it's if we did this webinar and didn't include a slide on cost, we would probably get a whole lot of side glances and confused folks, because it's probably one of the most measured and most emphasized measures in supply chain. The one thing though that I like to encourage folks to think is it's not just about the cost, but it's why is the cost there and what is driving the cost. It's only part of the story. And I'm reminded a project we did a few years back. There was a director of supply chain, and he was getting a lot of pressure by the COO on cost per mile. And every meeting you go in, you have your metric meeting review, and what's your cost per mile? What's your cost per mile? And he would come in and say, hey, we're having issues with dwell time at facilities. We're having issues with trying to show that it was one measure that had a lot of root causes, and just kept getting the pressure. And in a state of frustration, he goes back and he sends out his entire fleet to do a dry run one day with no volume. And so if you can imagine millions of dollars being spent all in this one surge to get miles going and no real deliveries. And then he comes in the next week. It ended up being his last month there as a result of this exercise. But he emphasized that, listen, our cost per mile was fantastic because we ran all of these miles without the additional cost of the waiting and the issues that I've been talking about. So we stayed around in the project to help with the organization of the networks and consolidation of facilities, and really improving the cost per mile from a total cost standpoint. But it is something that we've got to make sure that we understand the metric as it relates to other metrics and its root causes. And cost often goes along with service. And just as early on we talked about some of the resiliency and the sustainability, there's a balancing point between some of these. I was talking to a supply chain executive the other day that said that they're trending more towards less resiliency and more cost reduction because they may have overemphasized resiliency in the last couple of years. And you see it in the news cycle. Going into COVID and through COVID, is JIT inventory dead? And did it cause this problem? And then now we're a few years removed, and we're looking at all the inventory levels and saying, hey, let's get inventory out. Has anybody heard of this concept called just in time? And so as we think about these balancing of cost versus service, cost versus sustainability, a few metrics that I like in the service category, a case or a dollar fill rate. This is a percent of ordered units or order value filled in the first shipment. And this can be measured from a dichotomous or continuous perspective. So the continuous perspective, if I've got 100 pieces of one product on an order, that order has maybe 10 different lines, and I'm measuring the order fill rate, and I miss 10 pieces out of one part number. Overall, we may have a really high fill rate, a 99% fill rate. But depending on who our customer is, that customer may have needed those extra 10 pieces to fulfill one of their orders or to complete a production cycle. I remember years ago, Tesla was frustrated because they had these very expensive cars that could not come off the line because of $3 USB cable. And so when we think about that fill rate percentage, I like to also look at it dichotomous. Did we fulfill this order in full and on time? Yes or no? And if not, then boom, it dings against us and causes us to think a bit deeper about why we're not fulfilling orders. The on-time delivery or OTIF metrics, these are very popular. And so this can be presented as some form of a perfect order metric. Some of the OTIF metrics will include whether or not the product was stacked in a certain way or labeled in a certain way, and did it meet all of the expectations of that shipment coming in. And that's just a percent of the orders arriving on the expected delivery dates in the expected way. And then another metric that we like to use a lot is just the returns or warranty percentage. And this gives us a percent of units or percent of value that's returned or rejected by the customer. And so this is one that's very hard to argue with. If we had RMAs come in, if we had to spend money to bring it back to us or dispose of it in field, that is hard cost that says that something happened along the way that we want to reflect on and try to do differently. And so these service metrics can give us a balanced scorecard up against some of the cost metrics or other metrics that we're measuring, and operate together as a system. Roger, what say you?
Yeah, I think those are all good. I think the comment around understanding the impact to your customer is really important. So the Tesla example where there's a lot of a much bigger impact with very small in that case small item or immaterial cost item. What I always find interesting is when we go in to do a supply chain assessment or a strategy discussion with a shipper or even a manufacturer, anybody, and we start looking at metrics. It amazes me sometimes, just how simple metrics like you might think of an on-time delivery metric, right? Should be cut and dry. Did it get there when it was supposed to, or did it not? But there are so many nuances and so many variables that, we were working with a shipper not that long ago who we went in, we're doing an assessment on their performance, and their on-time delivery metrics were all 98, 99%. And this happened to be an industrial customer. And so shippers who were talking to some of their customer service reps, and they were saying they get all these complaints about late deliveries and this customer's upset and we always have to rush and expedite. And we tried to figure out what was going on. And it come to find out they weren't measuring delivery, they were measuring shipment. But the system they were using, the default metric was on-time delivery, but they were tracking actually did it ship on time. So again, it's just really important to make sure you know what your metrics are telling you and are they really relevant to what your customers are experiencing. I think the last kind of bucket we want to get into is cash flow. This is really critical to any organization. Cash is king. One of the big basic ones is just order to cash days. So from the time you receive an order, how long does it take you to actually get paid for that product, right? Because you've got inventory, cash, investment tied up in the product. It's really a measure of cash conversion. What's your cash conversion cycle? Usually measured in terms of days. It's again, as cost of capital has gone up recently and interest rates are higher than they had been, maybe not high overall historically, but they're certainly more than they've been for the last several years. Understand what's happening with your cash investments is really important, which plays into inventory turns, right? This is just you calculate based on dollars, based on units, but it's really, how many times a year am I turning over my inventory, or how many days of supply do I have in inventory, divided by 365. It helps you understand if your inventory is growing or if it's not, and it can play into that cash conversion cycle a little bit. And then average vendor days to pay. So, this is kind of the flip side to order to cash, right? Are you paying your vendors on time? Are you paying them? Do you even know what your terms are? When we do inbound assessments for people, sometimes what we find out is they're not quite sure what the actual terms are across different vendors because they don't have a contract management system or they just did a bid and so they changed it. And so sometimes the procurement team has one view of what the payment terms are, but their accounts payable team has a different view. And so by tracking some of this, you can start to understand if you have maybe some organizational variances or maybe some things need to be updated coming out of a recent procurement event that help you understand you don't want to be paying too early, but you also don't want to be paying too late. You want to maintain that sort of customer of choice or buyer of choice activity. Derek, anything on this to add for cash flow?
Yeah, no, the cash flows, cash is king, very, very important. It reminds me of a story. This was back in my lean days where a friend of mine opened up or bought a bike shop, and it was a custom bike shop. It was producing bikes for customers, and customers would come in, place an order, put their money on the table, and then walk away. And like 14 weeks later, they'd receive their product. And as he came in and started driving efficiency in the facility and how they ordered product, putting Kanban in place, he was able to take it down from like 14 weeks to 2 weeks. And excited as he was about it, he thought, hey, this is going to be great for the customer. Put it into place and started turning orders around in 2 weeks. And the customers got furious because they thought that they had transitioned from ordering custom bikes into getting these mass manufactured, non-custom type product at all. And so the solution he put in place was purely a cash play. He said, well, we're going to have them come in, place the order, and we'll slot the order. We'll schedule the order. We'll take the money. We'll sit on the money for 10 weeks. In the last 2 weeks, we'll produce the product and then ship it to the customer. Now the customer's thrilled, but cash is now flowing more positively. They're able to invest more into future projects and really manage the inventory levels. So as we're thinking about things like cash flow and what impacts cash flow. We don't want to forget who the customer is and what the customer expects. So those are a list of some of Roger and I's favorite metrics and what we like to do. We do have one question that popped up in the chat that's a fairly easy ask. Will the PowerPoint be available at the end of the discussion? And so we're going to be making this webinar. It's recorded, as well as content available, and we're hoping to create additional content for our customers at the conclusion of it, based off of the feedback that we get from this webinar. So looking forward to hearing your feedback as well. But speaking of feedback on measurement system, Roger, tell me some ghost stories. What was one of the most problematic measurement systems that you've ran into in your career?
Yeah, I think unfortunately it's one that happens more often than we'd like, and it's how many people get pigeonholed into metrics when they implement an ERP system or a WMS system or a labor management system. And at the time of go live, these were the metrics that were out of the box, and they were calculated a certain way. And now we come in and we start digging into the details 3 or 4 years later, and we find out that either the metrics been miscalculated, or most impactfully, it just wasn't relevant to the business. But what we also find that just and it happens is, at one point in time when something was developed, maybe the data you needed to get more granular wasn't available, but now it is. And so, it's a great exercise to take a look at all of your organizational metrics and just make sure that they are relevant and updated, and you're not stuck with bad assumptions that were made from 3 people in your role prior to you, right? So, a lot of times when I go into a company for a supply chain strategy discussion, and we ask, well, why are you tracking this? And it's, well, because that's what the guy before me tracked, or the woman before me tracked. And so it's a good opportunity to just take a look at what you're tracking. I mentioned the example about the on-time delivery. We helped that one shipper, they were only tracking on-time ship, not on-time delivery. And it was kind of, their minds were blown when they saw how poor the actual compliance was. And it was mostly because carriers would pick something up, and then since they knew they weren't tracked on delivery, sometimes they'd pick up a load in between and drop something off at a drop place. There's a lot of things that can happen behind the scenes if your metrics just aren't relevant. So a lot of interesting things out there. How about you, Derek?
Yeah, it's yeah. There's been a lot of challenging metrics. I think the funniest one that it wasn't funny at the time, but looking back on it, I was in this organization measuring as a form of OTIF, and they had 2 or 3 BISs that was propped up in the organization, and so we'd come in every week and just see yelling matches across the conference table, and at the end of the day, what they were arguing about was how it was measured, what system we should use, and not about the actual problems. And so as we think back to some of your rules of the road that you mentioned earlier, is that we want to make sure that it's actionable and it's purpose-filled. And if we find ourselves doing more arguments about what system we're using and how we're measuring, then we're missing the point. And so we need to make sure that it's accurate, make sure that it's good information, that's actionable, because it's all too often we get caught up having conversations about the wrong things. Speaking of systems, this Q&A time, and one of the questions popping up. So if you're in the audience, you've got questions, please feel free to drop them in. One of the questions come up here is, are there any common tools or technology that people use to calculate and publish their core KPIs? And Roger, I know you've done a lot of work in this area with how we manage dashboards for customers. Can you share a little bit about what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, just to be frank, spreadsheets are still kind of the primary use. Although what we find now is, especially when you look to share and collaborate with metrics, BI tools, we use Tableau for a lot of our metrics and dashboard activities with Microsoft BIs, and the kind of the big enterprise level BI tools. The key thing is, understanding the math behind the metric, and then make sure it's shareable in an editable format, right? So what we sometimes see is folks will send a PDF of a dashboard out and say, hey, here's your metrics from last week. Good luck trying to figure out what happened. What we see more often, and we really try to work with people on, is develop a little bit more of a dynamic reporting system, typically through an online portal, or at least a filterable pivot table within spreadsheets that people can look at. Because the goal of this is, again, make the metrics available, make sure they're usable and actionable, and then make sure somebody's accountable. And to do that, there's a number of tools that are out there. Most of the common enterprise level BI platforms will let you have an online portal that people can access to view and edit, or view and filter, but not edit. But at the end of the day, if it's sending spreadsheets out, that's still a good way to get some clarity to everybody.
Yeah, and then the big crystal ball question. A lot of votes on this one. What's the best metric to track to try to predict when the freight market will turn?
Yeah. So one, I think if you're not already following the Uber Freight market updates, we do one every month, and then we do a more comprehensive one every quarter. They're available on our website under the resources section. So that's the only kind of salesy thing I'm going to say today. But there is no one silver bullet. I think what's really important is there are macroeconomic factors that drive the freight markets, things like industrial production, retail inventory to sales ratios, overall CPI and inflation. What is probably more critical in the next couple of months is to understand how your network is reacting to the current freight market, whether it's going up or down. And that's where it's important to have the right metrics like primary carrier tender acceptance, spot versus contract premiums, on-time pickup. So it's really, there's not one metric to predict when it will turn. What's really important, though, is to understand how your network is performing today and track slight variances, because there is a view that says when things do turn, it may be slightly more rapid in terms of increasing cost or tightening capacity maybe than in years past. So the time to start looking for these kind of indicators or canaries in the coal mine is now. It's not going to be in Q3, 4, or 1 or 2 next year when you start to see it happen. So I wish I had a silver bullet for you. We track internally a number of different economic factors. From a shipper perspective, keeping track of your own freight, understand what's happening. And as we talked about with resiliency, make sure you understand where you need to have backups in place. Now's a good time to start putting that in place.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions coming in. One on any specific measures that we would have for cross-border or customs brokerage KPIs. And I think oftentimes when I hear those questions asked, they're saying, hey, there's certain things outside of our control, like how, congestion at the border or the responsiveness of the government entities or on the paperwork. And so we want to, do we even measure that? And I think it's valuable to measure lead time impacts of those things, even if we can't control them, so we can plan for them and plan around them. But I think more often than not in those operations, what is critical is the quality of the information that we're collecting and sending. And if we're collecting the right quality of information and sending it off at the right timing, usually those are cause and effect type activities to some of the delays that we see in the processes. In addition to that, making sure that we've got, good, accurate measures around what we should be paying, and then compliance efforts. So how compliant are we to various regulations? And sometimes that doesn't trend day over day, hour over hour, week over week. It's more of an audit that happens on a regular cadence that we may want to come in and see. Roger, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think you absolutely should be tracking the transactional performance of your customs brokers. And that can be things like timeliness of filings, or how many shipments are delayed at the border due to paperwork or due to waiting on incomplete paperwork to be filed, things like that. HTS code compliance, are they putting the right codes in the right shipment? So I do think, and we're a customs broker, we track ourselves. We have some ideas. If you're interested, you can reach out to us. We can talk through a few. We can also take a look at how you're managing things and help with some suggestions. But absolutely, especially with nearshoring and folks doing a lot more importing than maybe they had in the past, you should be getting a good level of accuracy and timely service from your customs brokers.
Yeah. Has anyone found a way to better forecast freight demand at a lane level? This question comes in.
Yeah, it's kind of like, can I tell you when the market's going to turn, right? I think lane level forecasting is an interesting view. Everybody wants to do it. Nobody does it well. And at the end of the day, unless you're forecasting accurately, 3 or 4 days out to where a carrier is going to reposition equipment, it's important. But what might be more important is to make sure you're tracking things like load availability. So even if I have a freight forecast, but my loads are 2 or 3 hours behind at a warehouse shipping, like that's a really impactful metric. I think the other thing when we think about lane level forecasting is, we start to see folks put a little less focus on the absolute daily number or the absolute weekly number per lane, but more about, are you able to capture the big changes appropriately? So do you have a way to trigger when demand overall is coming in hotter than expected that might make you want to revisit your quantity commitments with your carriers? do you have a good process integrated with your IBP or sales and operations planning process to know when promotions are coming? So you may not be able to tell them exactly the number of loads on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, but you can start to prepare ahead of time that you'll see a 30% bump, and you know it's going to come at a certain time. So some of it is, there's a lot of effort to try to pinpoint that really detailed daily lane level view. Sometimes, though, that comes at the expense of even more impactful major node events that are coming that you should have been able to forecast for, at least at a facility or a customer level.
No, that's good. Question came in on the forecasting, MPE or directional accuracy versus MAPE or an absolute accuracy. And I think the question is probably going to be largely dependent on what level you're measuring. If you're measuring and how you're using that metric. If you're measuring at maybe an overall sales attainment level versus a manufacturing capacity level, a product family level, or even down to a SKU level, both of those metrics can be important. We do want to know not just how far off we are, but what direction are we off. And then as we gain more sophistication in our measurement system and forecasting tools, we can start pulling in and say, hey, we see that sales tends to be 10% higher than in their forecast than what's being achieved. We see that production capacity planning is going to be 10% lower than what's achieved. And we can start to balance it out in our algorithms by correcting for that to try to get more narrow. But it all depends on kind of where you're measuring, and both those metrics can be very important. Another one, are there metrics specific to private or dedicated fleets that we should be tracking?
Yeah, absolutely. And you should be managing your private or dedicated fleets differently than you manage your over-the-road carrier fleets. So there's a number of different metrics. So we help manage dedicated fleets for a number of shippers. We run our own dedicated fleets, and we help with private fleets. And, there are some specific metrics, things around, cost per mile, backhaul utilization or percent of backhaul revenue, turns per truck per day. A lot of that depends on the exact structure of your fleet. So is it a local fleet where you're trying to turn multiple days, multiple shipments a day, or is it a more regional fleet where you're trying to focus on getting, third-party backhaul revenue to offset empty miles? So there are a number of metrics unique to the design of a fleet that's important to track. But generally, the message I'd say is yes, they are generally also different than what you might want to track for your over the road, because on a private or dedicated fleet perspective, you're now accountable for more of the operational variability than you are over the road. And so your metrics need to reflect some of that. Again, the big ones tend to be turns per truck per day, empty mile percent backhaul revenue. But to Derek's example earlier about the fleet that went and did a bunch of empty miles, it's also important to make sure that those metrics match your needs, not maybe your underlying carrier. We sometimes see fleets that have a lot of backhaul or low empty miles, but it's because they're going after unprofitable backhauls. And so one metric looks really good, but you're actually spending money chasing freight that you're not getting compensated for. So if you're using the same metrics for dedicated or private fleet versus over the road, now's a great time to take another more level of detail at it. So this might actually be maybe our last one here, Derek. I think we're coming up on time.
Yeah, we're right at time. And I'm going to have to see if this was submitted by one of our team members just to stump us, because this one's a hard one. How do you measure order accuracy for direct-to-consumer orders? What data inputs would you recommend using to determine SKU quantity mismatch between the order and what was physically delivered? And this is a very challenging one, because oftentimes if let's say there's a unit of measure order or unit of measure problem in a forward-facing facility, we're going to catch that later on with inventory accuracy and not necessarily with feedback from consumers, because our consumers, they may receive the package and they ordered a pack of 3, but they receive a pack of 12 and they get excited as, hey, we're getting a bonus here, and don't say a thing about it. They'll typically let us know if we don't ship or if we undership, and we'll get some feedback from when it's delivered. But what I would encourage here, number one, is if you start to see issues kind of in the supply chain, start performing proactive audits of orders going out. That doesn't mean that every order has to be inspected, but if you do a statistical sample of what's going out and identify some of the common causes, and those common causes we can then go back and operationally fix in our supply chain. That's usually kind of first phase of what I'd implement. And then the second piece to this question, I think, if we're seeing some of the order accuracy for direct customer orders, if there's issues with addresses and us getting addresses in that are undeliverable, or oftentimes there's challenges with, they use one name for the road and UPS or the USPS uses another name for a road. As that information is coming in, what we're seeing more and more is the online stores and even TMSs and PTMSs like we have will get more sophisticated with address validation or verification as part of the process, where there's an automated process that'll flag something before anything's shipped or anything moves through the supply chain and say, here's an issue. And oftentimes can put it all the way back to the customer when the customer's placing the order. And we've all seen that when we go in and order, did you mean this address versus that? Or if we see kind of common mistakes made in the ordering process, we see that you're ordering this. Did you also want to order this with it? Or we see that you did not order this. Is this right? You kind of are you sure? Or before you leave. And what sophisticated supply chain and merchandising orgs are kind of getting together, and they're merging the operational side with the sales side to say, this is a way for us to increase revenue on some of these supply chain elements as well. So not only does the customer get a better experience, but we can increase revenue as well. Now, that brings us to the end. We want to thank everyone for your time today. As always, we appreciate your investment into this time. We've got supply chain consulting on the 2 decades. We've got a QR code that you can scan here and take a small test to see how prepared your supply chain is. And follow up from this, we're going to make this webinar recording and slide deck available to everyone that attended. And so we want to encourage your participation in downloading that, sharing it around, and giving us feedback. So if any question that we didn't get to that you'd like a follow-up conversation with Roger and I, we'd love to meet with you and make sure we're answering your question. So everyone have a great day and a fantastic weekend if we don't talk before then.
Thanks, everybody.